Good morning, everyone. Let's go ahead and get started. We're 1 minute past the hour. Before I invite Dr. Anuma to introduce our distinguished speaker, who is a close friend and someone I try to emulate as best as we can. We all should, I think. I'd like to just a few announcements. One, next week we have a fellows debate for Grand Rounds. Please make sure you attend or dial in. I believe Catherine Clark and Sam Reinhardt are going to be leading those efforts. And the following week, we have a special presentation by Dr. Silvio Nzuki of our own Yale School of Medicine. So with that, Dr. Onuma, please do the honors.
Thank you very much, Dr. Velasquez. Hello to everyone. As you heard during Grand Rounds, we have a little bit of a leadership transition here, so hopefully we can work together moving forward. So welcome to Yale Cardiology Grand Rounds. Today we have an extremely special speaker, and I'm just going to put you on. Today's talk is a very special one, and we're truly lucky to have Dr. Clyde Yancey here with us today. I'm going to keep this intro short. I asked him, what would you like me to say? He said, as short as possible. And I said, well, maybe you shouldn't have done so much to make that difficult. But I would prefer to keep it short as well, because I want to spend more time hearing from him. Dr. Yancey truly is one of the greats in cardiology. He's currently the chief of cardiology at Northwestern University Feinberg School of Medicine, and he's also the vice dean of diversity and inclusion. He trained or went to medical school at Tulane University in New Orleans and trained in cardiology at UT Southwestern and remained in Dallas for several years before moving to Chicago. His scholarship, we don't have the time to get into all of the details, but his scholarship is impeccable. He has published over 500 peer-reviewed articles and is one of the most cited writers of scientific literature. He's currently the deputy editor of JAMA Cardiology and the senior section editor in heart failure for JACC. He is the former president of the American Heart Association and is the immediate past chair of the ACC-AHA Heart Failure Guideline Writing Committee. And these are just select, highlights of his very, very extensive CV. He has mentored countless students, trainees, and faculty. Dr. Yancey truly walks the talk. He has a deep commitment to excellence, a deep commitment to improving the quality of care, and as we will hear today, a deep and very tireless commitment to addressing health equity. So it is a true honor and privilege to introduce Dr. Clyde Yancey.
Well, good morning. Are you able to hear me okay? Is this application system? Good. So good morning. Good morning. So are you able to hear me okay? Good morning. Good morning. Listen, Eric knows I still wear my Southern boots on, so I like the cordialities of how we start the day. I am delighted to have the opportunity to be here. I want to congratulate Eric publicly on his leadership. I've seen Mr. Rick Russell over many years. I was one of the original investigators in Stitch, and Eric Velasquez comes in and he's given the torch from all of the investigators that did really very, very well. And it's been just a real joy. I didn't think it was working, yeah. It's been a real joy to watch his career flourish, so really congratulations. And I'm delighted to be amongst friends and people that we collaborate with and sometimes commiserate with. I saw as I walked in this morning that on February 28th, you will have an extensive seminar that is addressing healthcare disparities, and I applaud you for doing that. And you're bringing in a number of my peers in this space who have important commentaries that they will undoubtedly share with you with great skill and precision. And then on March 12th, you are hosting Dr. Michelle Albert, another one of my friends and colleagues, who really will help you make a transition to some of the science behind these issues of disparate outcomes across the board, but especially in cardiovascular care. When Eric and I were discussing what kinds of things I might share with you, we talked about heart failure, We talked about some of the translational science in which I'm still involved, trying to unravel why particular cohorts have a unique burden of cardiovascular disease. But we really landed on this theme that I've been curating over the last year or so, because a number of audiences are very comfortable with the vernacular. You hear diversity and inclusion all the time. But quietly, a number of audiences are very uncomfortable with the concept, because if you take the same suite of services or the same opportunities for leadership and you talk about bringing other people into that space, people that weren't there before, necessarily means someone else is exiting that space. And it's been difficult for people to be at ease with the idea of yielding a position of authority or power to another person. And so part of what I've been trying to do is to help build a narrative to share with audiences across the country on why is there the necessity to think like this? Is it just a social good? Can we actually build the case for diversity and inclusion? And so in our joint communications, we decided that that's how we would progress. Typically, this is the part during a presentation where someone provides disclosures. I have no relevant relationships with industry, but there are some very important disclosures that I'd like to make right now. And it really allows me to publicly thank you for your very kind and generous introduction. I'm humbled by what you said, and there are some things we've been able to accomplish. But over time, I almost didn't become a doctor. I got to tell you this story, though. So as we were driving in, I said, you know, you got to show me something. Part of my journey to becoming a physician is based at Yale. So in the summer of 1981, I came up here to study pediatric cardiology with Norman Towner. And it was a fantastic summer. And it was fantastic for three reasons. The education was splendid. Dr. Towner's embrace of me was incredible. I would go to his home in the evening, and it turns out that he was a Civil War buff. And so he thought that a kid from Louisiana should be facile with all things related to the Civil War. And I was relatively naive, and before I knew it, I was reading the Confederacy of Dunces, and we were talking about great battle sites, and it was just a remarkable summer to see the human being that Dr. Towner was. And then I had a chance to live in New Haven, Connecticut, and I'll share with you some stories about it. So we had to drive by to try to find this quadrangle that I still remember of where I lived for 3 months, and we thought we saw just a glimpse of it this morning, so thank you very much for that. But part of the journey for me becoming a doctor incorporates Yale. But back on point, so the reason that this is my disclosure is the following. I was born in a segregated community in Louisiana, Scotlandville. Even today, the household income is at $26,000. And so it continues to be an at-risk community. I had lived in functionally a single-parent household. My father deserted us when I was very young. I was educated in segregated schools from kindergarten, not only through high school, but even into college. Specifically, I had a number of encounters that were hate-filled, particularly with the KKK. I personally drank from colored fountains, rode in the back of the bus, watched movies from the balcony, ate meals in the kitchen of restaurants. I was falsely accused as a young man multiple times, and I was constantly told I would never make it, and people were constantly telling me, forget about trying to become a doctor. I attended a historically black college university, even though based on college entrance exams, I was recruited by a number of the Ivies, but we had no resources to even engage in that application process. And even when I got to Tulane, I had to pass the hat amongst relatives to get the $800 fee to hold my place at Tulane. I got to Tulane still without a way to pay for my education. But miracles happen. And on the Friday of the first week when I was walking to the dean's office to withdraw and try to work for a year and earn money, there was in my mailbox a full scholarship for my freshman year. I still remember that mailbox number K30, and that's how this whole journey began. I tell you that because it lines up uniquely with this tweet from my good friend Harlan, who apologized for not being here this morning, but we've shared by email a lot of the concepts that I'm going to discuss with you. And he made this incredibly prescient comment in the Twitter space, and I've highlighted with the red arrow. Special efforts are required to overturn historic norms and behavior. Now remember the subtext of what I'm talking to you about. I'm making the case for diversity, and the subtext is a necessary but inconvenient truth. And Harlan has the courage to step up and say that there are normative behaviors that we all have that, quite frankly, need to be revisited. So let's go through the first of several thought experiments. Over the next 30 minutes or so, there'll be about 3 of these thought experiments that I want you to go through. But this is the first thought experiment, and I'll just be quiet. I'll share with you a number of images, and I want you to think about what comes to mind. Here's the first image. Here's the second image. Here's the third image. Yet another. And this one is uniquely germane to Chicago because we continue to fight issues of rates of homicide. So you think about the immediate responses you had when you saw these images. Now let's transition. What did you think about? These are the common themes that are in our social media and our vernacular today. But did you also think about equity when you saw these images? Did you also think about social injustice when you saw these images? What about social determinants of health? What I'm getting at is a phenomenon so incredibly well described in Kahneman's book. It's thinking fast and thinking slow. If we all think fast, every thought that I shared with you that was the reflex response is exactly the thought that I would have expected you to have and me to have. But when you turn on a different set of cognitive pathways and think more cognitively about the images you see, that is the slow pathway, you see more than what's really there at first glance. Let me give you another exercise. Just take a look at this image. This image is pretty popular. A lot of people have seen it, but this is a different iteration of the image. Most times when this is depicted, you see the representation of equality and equity. But I love the third panel of reality. And this really describes the barrier, the challenges that we're trying to overcome. And so for those that say, why don't we just treat everyone equally? You see, we still end up in a scenario where not everything is the same. There are some definitions here that are important. When we're talking about diversity, and particularly anticipating the seminar you'll have at the end of this month, we should understand that there are at least 3 iterations of this definition. They were coined, or at least they were authenticated by Mark Nivek when he was with the AAMC. He's actually now at Tulane. But diversity 1.0 is just simply the acknowledgement that there is a difference between groups of people. And usually in such a case, the response is some sort of social justice movement. Women's right to vote is one very good example of that. The ability for persons who are gay to intermarry is another example of that. The civil rights movement is an example of that. Version 2.0 goes to the point of trying to attack a root cause and be informative, to be innovative, and come up with a strategy that might overcome it quickly. Most of the things that we've done under version 2.0 have failed, but it's version 3.0 that really is important. Because version 3.0 takes a very different approach. Yes, it acknowledges that there are differences, and yes, it acknowledges that most times targeted programs don't work very well, no matter how well intentioned. But version 3.0 says the reason you embrace this conversation about diversity is that it's a pathway towards excellence. It's looking for skill wherever you can curate that skill, and you're appreciating that there's so many different lenses that come to the table that are very important. Now I have another question for you. Everyone's looking at the graphic, but look at me now. All eyes here. So when you look at me, what do you see? You see a bald man, kind of tallish, but what else do you see? You see what you're afraid to articulate. You see a black man. You see a minority. So now what does a minority mean in today's world? Well, this is very important because as we sit in this room today, epidemiology tells us that for persons under the age of 18, there is no longer a majority population in this country. Yes, there are more white people, and there will be. but there no longer will be 51% of this country that represent any particular ethnicity or race. And there is a difference, by the way. Ethnicity, by definition, is Hispanic or not, Latino or not, depending on your interpretation. Race gets to a very different categorization, so try not to conflate those things. I say this to you because here is another part of the necessary but inconvenient truth. If you intend to thrive going forward, the CEO of your hospital is here. If he intends to drive this hospital into prosperity, you can't exclude aspects of your population that are different from your usual, because you will lose 50% or more of the people you serve. The world is changing, and this is another reason why we should be thoughtful. So the first thing I'll say, and I'll build this slide towards the end with more bullet points, but the first really important bullet point about making the case for diversity and inclusion is that the community is changing. The population demographics are changing. We have to acknowledge a very different reality as we go forward. So let's talk about some other things that are really important. Going from that first platform, building the case, to the next platform. These data were published in JAMA Network Open. I have the privilege of being one of the editors in the JAMA Network. It's JAMA Cardiology. Harlan is one of the editors with JAMA Network Open. And this was really fascinating. This is a 30-year portrayal of health status in this country. As you work through the data, what I will share with you is evidence that starting in panel A, looking at the yellow line, average health is trending down. Looking at income disparities, they are increasing. Black-white disparities are increasing. Metrics of health justice and a metric of health equity are both falling off. Even when we incorporate the presence of the Affordable Care Act, which should have corrected some of this, we have not seen a pivot point where these issues have turned around. So the first aspect here is that there's evidence globally that health equity has not been achieved. What about in cardiovascular medicine? I really enjoyed shepherding these data as they came to JAMA Cardiology from presentation through publication, and ultimately ended up editorializing on these data. But all of us understand the importance of protecting patients from the risk of stroke in the setting of atrial fibrillation. If you look at the actual data with regards to use of the newer, now called direct oral anticoagulants versus warfarin, we all understand that it's not just quality of life difference now. There are survival advantages in favor of the DOACs. What we see here is a greater use of warfarin in minority communities and a lesser use of the DOACs. Now, these data were published in 2018, but could it be that in 2018 we're still seeing these kinds of cardiovascular disparities? Let me be very clear. I'm not talking about the natural history of atrial fibrillation. I'm talking about the decisions we make as physicians about how we treat patients. And those decisions and these data points really demonstrate that for some reason, there is a differential application of this decision-making process that tracks with race and ethnicity. How about something a little bit closer to home? At Northwestern, we really take a leading position in structural heart disease interventions, and we really have been a part of TAVR from the first partners trial throughout, and I'm sure that here at Yale you've got a structural heart program as well. What about the use of TAVR as a function of race and ethnicity? You can only imagine what I'm about to show you. I want you to pay very careful attention to the vertical axis. The vertical axis is the percent application of TAVR as a function of race and ethnicity. And I want you to look at the percent of blacks in the blue line, Hispanics in the red line, and the gray line is others. If you're having trouble looking at this, let me give you the big picture. 96% of all TAVR applications in this country are for white people. Only 4% go to anyone that's non-white. Let me make this a little bit more evident. There's been an explosive and appropriate growth of TAVR. You can look at the increase in the number of centers over just a few years. Over 8 years, the number of centers has gone from 141 to 445, yet there's not been an inflection point at all, in the percent application for minorities. You can look at a heat map of the United States, and you can see the differential application of this very effective strategy, and this differential application parallels typical statements about how individuals are treated uniformly. Now, the scientists in the room, me included, would say, well, wait a minute. Maybe there is something different about the biology here. This is different from atrial fibrillation because there is something different about the biology in atrial fibrillation as well. It is correct that there's more calcific AS in whites. It is correct that there's more bicuspid aortic valves. But what is an evident truth is that if one looks at the lower right column, aortic stenosis outcomes, there's absolutely no difference as a function of race and ethnicity and outcomes. So you can't challenge the notion that these patients are higher risk. But what you realize when you look at this more carefully is that there is about a 50% less likelihood for any intervention for aortic stenosis if a patient happens to be Black or Latino, 50% less likely. And so once again, it says at some critical threshold when we as practitioners are in our disease management mode or in our shared decision-making mode, we are exercising some sort of thought process that is disinclining us from making decisions in the same way for the same disease, regardless of the patient that's in front of us. So if the first case that I made for diversity and inclusion was that the world is changing and we have more diversity in the population, the second case is that there is palpable and incontrovertible evidence that there are differences in cardiovascular medicine as a function of race and ethnicity that may in part be related to the way we make decisions and in part may be related to the workforce composition. This is the pivotal moment in my presentation. We worked for 15 minutes to see if this will come together. So here goes. I hope Paul isn't too far away. So I want you to just watch this for a moment. It's on the screen, but you can listen. Let's see if that will do it. All right, well, it's great music. No, we'll keep going. I'm not going to, we'll just keep going. I've got to resume slideshow. Yeah. No worries. No worries. We can just go back to the presentation. So if you could see it, I'm sure you enjoyed the clip, but if you could see it, what you would have noticed is that everyone in the choral section was female, and every single person in the orchestra was a white man. And so there was this remarkable, let me just get this going. Yeah, I'm good. Yeah. So there was this remarkable observation that that wasn't right. And so it's a classic experiment in psychology where the next step that was done was to anonymize all the auditions. So much so that the candidates took their shoes off and put slippers on so no one could listen to the pace or listen to the cadence of heels to sort out the gender, and a screen was erected. So the only thing you had to judge the candidacy of the applicant was their skill, their talent with the violin, the viola, the cello, etc. And look at the difference in all the major symphonies in this country. By anonymizing auditions, look at what happened. Meaning that all along, there were women that were clearly sufficiently talented to be a part of the major orchestras in this country. But someone was introducing a willful decision-making process that biased the decision away from selecting women and in favor of selecting men. Remember what I just showed you about TAVR and what I just showed you about DOACs versus warfarin. So what can we talk about when we think about bias? Because that's the big issue. There is a certain biology here. There's a certain reality. Remember the subtext, the inconvenient truth. Are we all biased? How do we see the world? So let's think about this. Bias is not anything we should run from. We should not look at this as a pejorative statement. Everyone in society works with an unconscious automatic influence which constitutes their bias. In a seminal study done at Hopkins with medical students, 70% of medical students using implicit bias tests have a preference for white men. We've replicated the same thing at Northwestern. I've been running the bias course there for 8 years, and the 70% number stays. What is this concept of implicit bias? It's a concept that influences the way we make decisions, and it is a shortcut in our decision-making process. We see an image, we feel an image, and thus we declare a reality that may or not be correct. And look at all the different domains in which bias might live, and think about the domains that we deal with on a regular basis. We deal with this in the clinic all the time. What's the physical appearance? We think about this when we're judging fellows or residents or medical students, even faculty members. What's the personality like? Is there eye contact? Are they engaging? Are they not? And we all the time talk about the academic pedigree. Are we not instituting some bias? So let's go with the second thought experiment. You've already had one. Two, if the symphony thing would have worked. But here is the next thought experiment. I want you to look very carefully at the image in front of you. What do you see? You see a frog or a horse? Anybody see the horse? What's your name? Yeah. So Lauren, turn your head to the right. No, your head on your right shoulder. Tilt. What do you see now? Do you see the horse? Honestly, not really. All right. Lauren, keep your head tilted, and look at the mane here. Look at the nose where you thought you saw the frog's eyes. Look at the ear. Look at the horse's eye where you thought you saw the frog's hindquarters. Do you see it, Lauren? Someone saw it. Yeah. So what you've just done is you've taken the same image, but you've changed your perspective. You've changed your lens, and you've seen something different. Now let's try this again. What do you see? Do you see a young woman with a distant gaze looking out over the horizon? Or do you see a harried, older woman with coarse features? Hopefully you do see both. So if you see the younger woman, you can see her nose is at about 9 o'clock. There's a feather coming out of her hair up at about 11 o'clock. You can see that she's got beautiful features. But the older woman has a chin that's right here. The big nose is pointing down towards about 6:30. The eyes are there, and they're buried below a coif of hair. So again, just telling you that there is more information to be seen if you take the time and look differently. One more thought experiment. This is a classic experiment in psychology. This is called Herman's grid. Some of you may have seen this before, but what do you see when you look up here? I'm not going to pick on you again, Lauren. Thank you for being so willing. But what do you see? It's okay, they're black boxes. It's not a trick. But do you see anything else? Do you see anything else? Someone said circles. You see gray circles in between the black boxes. Yes, yes. So again, you see information there when you take your time and look differently. Here's the last thing. Complete this puzzle. This is really simple. There's 9 dots here. Connect the dots with one continuous line, but don't interrupt the line. Don't take the virtual pen or pencil off the paper. Connect the dots. Maybe it's not as easy as I said it was, and it doesn't make sense until you think unconventionally. When you think unconventionally, it all comes together. So what did we just do? We looked at a couple of images, and we convinced ourselves that if we use a different lens, we see a different data set. We went through an exercise where if we cogitate longer, if we turn on our slow pathways, there's more density, there's more data in the image than what we see at the first time. And we realized that sometimes to solve a problem, we have to think slightly unconventionally to get there. So this gives us an opportunity to appreciate that this is fun, but in the clinical setting, these same things are happening. We're seeing images in the ICU. We're seeing images in the office. And we are immediately exercising thought economy because what? You got 17 minutes. I'm counting RVUs. I know you're counting RVUs. You got 17 minutes and you have to get your Epic note closed. So we're looking for any kind of thought expediency we can come up with. Stereotyping bias helps us get through that process, but we have to pause for a moment. And one of the important strategies to deal with this awareness that we all have bias is to check your assumptions at the door. These are some important comments that others have made about the pernicious influence of bias. I'll put all of them up, but I will point to my favorite, which is the one that is attributed to Confucius. And this is not gender specific in my mind. A gentleman can see a question from all sides without bias. The small man is biased and can only see a question from one side. So I think that's helpful. And again, getting back to the root of who we are as physicians, I embrace being a doctor. It defines my being. This is the essence of that relationship. This is what I worked on when I was here in the summer of 1981. You're sitting in front of a patient, you're obtaining subjective information, the history, you're uploading the objective data, and the yellow eye, that's the moment when you have to interpret everything. And if your interpretations reflect awareness of who that patient is in the greater scheme of things, then your interventions lead to blue and green stars. But if that interpretive moment is influenced by stereotyping or bias in your decision making, is not nearly as helpful. So we've made it to 3 platforms. Making a case for diversity, platform 1, the population is changing, the demographics are changing. Platform number 2, we are concerned about healthcare disparities. That's different from diversity. And we think that at least in part, those disparities exist because of the way we make decisions, and the way we make decisions reflects our unfamiliarity with some patients that are in front of us. And platform number 3 is implicit bias and its pernicious influence. So let's continue to move on and now think about how do we overcome these issues of bias, and how do we really make this case for diversity? This is a really nice comment about giraffes and turtles. We can't expect people with turtle views and movements on diversity to make giraffe decisions on the development and inclusion of marginalized groups in the workplace. So I'm going to talk about how do we enhance diversity in the workforce. Well, let's look at cardiologists. Look at the distribution of African Americans and Hispanics in the population of the United States, 17% and 13% respectively. And then look at the representation as cardiologists, 5%, and 2.7%, 5% and 2.7%. Let's make this even more detailed. Let's deconstruct cardiology into procedural-based cardiovascular medicine and not procedural-based, thinking about electrophysiology and interventions, and see the representation falls to about 3% from numbers that are about 6% overall. These data, published just last year, look at adult cardiology fellows by sex and adult cardiologists by sex, and you see that over a decade, the number is absolutely flat. Absolutely flat. No meaningful change. If we now look at adult cardiology fellows, we see the same thing. If we look at race and ethnicity, everybody's clustered near the bottom, and we see the numbers essentially not changing very well. There's an increase in persons that are self-described as Asian. These data were just published February 7th, so just within the last several days. And I'll expand it so you can see. This is trends in racial and ethnic distribution in internal medicine and our subspecialties. Now, this is a bit disheartening because these data go out through 2018. I want you to look at two things. Your eye is going to train towards cardiology, which is the red dot. But I want you to also look at GI, which is kind of the magenta dot. There's a message here that in these subspecialties that are procedurally based, where income is higher, that's where you see the lowest representation with regards to diversity. And if you put up these tabular data, and I've highlighted cardiology with the purple arrow, over 12 years, fundamentally, the number for cardiology has not changed. And if you think about this, particularly for women, this is during a time where the percent women in medical school is over 50%, it's 52% at Northwestern, where the percent of women entering internal medicine is near 50%, but you don't see that in our subspecialties, particularly in our procedurally based subspecialties. Why is that? I think we should be bold enough to realize that there's something we need to address here. What about the pipeline? These are data from the AAMC. I've interjected purple arrows so you can look at all of the underrepresented in medicine groups, and you can see 2015, 2016, 2017, 2018. The numbers in red show fundamentally no movement in these groups, and so it is important. I'm particularly persuaded by what I'm going to share with you now. If you go beyond the pipeline, let's look at Figure 1. Figure 1 shows you the diversity within schools of medicine. Because no matter what the endpoint is, practice or academics, everybody goes through medical school. The blue bars here, the blue lines here for clinical faculty, the gold lines are for basic science faculty. And you can see the preponderance here of persons that are assistants and associates. But what's really remarkable now is that if you look at and this is URM faculty, by the way, if you look at URM matriculation, there's a message here that is quite striking. The higher penetration of URM medical students, call it 14, 15, 16% or greater, really appears to be associated with those centers, whereas there is the highest representation of professors and associate professors. That is where there are people in leadership that are representative of the groups we're targeting. Our own American College of Cardiology has a task force on diversity and inclusion, which I'm delighted to co-chair. And it really is courtesy of Pam Douglas to think of this whole concept going from the deep pipeline to recruitment to retention to leadership, and we're actively working on that. So I've added, if you will, a fourth pillar to the case. There's demonstrable evidence that there is a lack of diversity in the cardiovascular workforce. It certainly doesn't parallel So the demographics are part of the case. The presence of disparate outcomes is part of the case. Implicit bias is part of the case. And the absence of diversity in our workforce. But let's think about this a little bit further. How can we turn this around? Here's the first concept I want to share with you. Anyone ever heard about allyship? This is going beyond diversity. This is where leaders like Eric become incredibly important. This is an active, consistent practice of unlearning and reevaluating in which a person of privilege seeks to engage another person. Remember I showed you the tweet from Harlan? When you have to start to change normative behaviors, this is the beginning of a conversation about allyship. And what about this concept of privilege? Remember the subtext, a necessary but inconvenient truth. No one in today's world likes to be told that they have privilege. Well, what about privilege? It is a strong force, but it's not always negative. Just like power, power is a strong force, but it's not always negative. Privilege does not equal bias, and the absence of privilege does not mean it's the absence of bias. But are you privileged? Let me take you through a thought experiment. I won't go through this. I'll leave this up for a minute. But just go down the list. Are you privileged? Look at the variables that define privilege on this graphic. It's fair to say that everyone in this room, just because you're educated, everyone in this room is privileged. So the idea of allyship is when you have this power, are you comfortable embracing another person? Allyship, in fact, is the secret. That's how we begin to deal with diversity, by taking on ownership and helping to support other people. It's a lifelong process of engaging with others, of coaching, of helping others grow and learn. But let's continue this process. And this, again, may be uncomfortable, but it's necessary. Remember, this is February, and February is Black History Month. Does this sound familiar? I must confess that over the past few years, I've been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride toward freedom is not the white Citizens Council or the Ku Klux Klaner, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action, who paternalistically believes he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by a mythical concept of time, and who constantly advises the Negro to wait for a more convenient season. Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. Lukewarm acceptance is much more bewildering than outright rejection. Sponsorship. A mentor, all of us serve as mentors, is an advisor. But a sponsor is a person that can really make something happen. A sponsor believes in you, a sponsor has power, a sponsor gives you their brand and brings you into the equation. How can you be a better ally? There are only 3 steps. What's the first one? Have a seat. What's the second one? Shut up. And what's the third one? Listen. Surprisingly, as a leader at Northwestern, I do this over and over and over again, and I'm surprised how many times that works. But here's the critical thing, and I'm so glad so many of you have stayed engaged and have given me your attention, because this is the business case, and I think this really is the flashpoint. If you are successful with your diversity and inclusion efforts, don't white men lose out. If you take from one and give to another, question is qualified. Is that fair? This is the question that's in everyone's head, but no one has the courage to step up and raise it because of all of the consternation you would receive. This is why I made the point earlier that diversity and inclusion is not about taking away. It's about excellence, it's about growth, and it's about prosperity. And if you don't believe me, then let's take lessons learned from corporate America. So let's start with the Harvard Business Review. What can we take from the Harvard Business Review? Leaders who create inclusive environments where diverse voices are welcome and engaged were nearly twice as likely as others to achieve value-driving insights. Employees in those environments were 3.5 times as likely to contribute their full innovative potential. That's from the Harvard Business Review. What about from Deloitte? Deloitte says that an inclusive culture constitutes a twofold increase in the ability to meet financial targets, threefold increase in the likelihood of being high performing, sixfold increase in the likelihood to be innovative, and eightfold increase in the likelihood to have better business outcomes. Do not think medicine is different from business. What does Forbes say? I love this. This looks at the quality of decision making. The x-axis, if you will, is a parameter or metric of making better decisions. Better decisions when you have an all-male group, 58%. Gender diversity, 73%. Age and gender diversity, 80%. Age, gender, and geographical diversity, 87%. These are the entities that are managing the largest corporations in our country. And they're telling us the lessons they've learned is that you don't lose anything from diversity, you gain from diversity. So when the question becomes, what happens when you seemingly take something away from another individual? If your lens is near field and you're only seeing what's right in front of you, then you're correct. Someone's taking your position and giving it to another. But when your lens is the far field, when it's the enterprise, when it's what's happening in your division of cardiology, when it's what's happening in your hospital, when it's the far lens and you take advantage of the benefits of innovation, of quality, of performance that's achieved from a diverse audience, or a diverse workforce, a diverse population, you end up in a better place. So what are the strategies to achieve diversity and to mitigate bias? Recognize that you have bias, and this may impact your decisions that may be at odds with your intentions. Develop the capacity to shine a light on yourself. Be an ally, mentor, and even be a sponsor. Courageous conversations qualify when you call in with curiosity versus calling out because you're concerned about someone's statement or behavior. Diversify the way you select persons for recognition, for participation. Consider the microenvironments, consider policies that hold others back, and remember that very important business case. Corporate America figured this out a long time ago. Companies thrive when diversity and inclusion is a part of their DNA. So I've tried to do this for you. I've tried to make this case for diversity and inclusion. I've built it on the changing demographics. I've built it on the importance to address disparate diseases. I've introduced the importance of the pernicious influence of implicit bias. I've tried to show you that there's evidence of a lack of diversity in cardiovascular medicine. But I've also showed you that bias can be overcome with awareness, with allyship and sponsorship. And I've tried to make the compelling argument that corporate America has already made us understand that diverse organizations are better organizations. So I'll close with two quotes. One is from Leonardo da Vinci. I've been impressed with the urgency of doing. Knowing is not enough, we must apply. Being willing is not enough, we must do. We recently lost one of the premier professors at the Harvard School of Business, Clayton Christensen, who really had been the savant, if you will, for much of the Silicon Valley, and really used his own life as a way of teaching best practices in business. He recently died from a lymphoma, but he said this is my final recommendation. Think about the metric by which your life will be judged, not by your accolades, but by the people you've helped. And make a resolution to live every day so that in the end, your life will be judged as success. Thanks very much.
First give the opportunity to our fellows, particularly if anyone of our fellows wants to ask the first question.
Where do your fellows hang out? Mine usually hang out in the upper right.
They're in the back. Anybody brave enough to ask?
Yes, sir.
Just in terms of the outcomes that you highlighted with the disparities in minorities, has there been a way to tease out the socioeconomic impact of that versus just a core racial aspect of like tap lungs or heart failure, whatever it is?
Yeah, so the question that I'll rephrase as I can appreciate it is to what extent might the obvious explanation apply, particularly if you're thinking about cardiovascular disease disparities? That is socioeconomics, the social determinants of health to which any of us could be vulnerable. And that is a splendid question. And it turns out that in most data sets, there still is a prevailing factor that appears to be attributable to race only or ethnicity only. That is, you can't adjust it away. We do this kind of research all the time. You can take poverty, you can take obesity, you can take food deserts, the whole thing, but you can't fully adjust it away, particularly in things that involve a decision-making process. Yes, you can reduce the evidence, but you can't fully adjust it away. Right. Yes?
We have a national study of MD, PhD trainees at 32 institutions and looked at URMs who are interested in research academic careers. And given health disparities require some research to try to understand what are, salient basic science mechanisms difference, we noticed that URMs were less likely interested in basic science and translational research. Just wondering what you're doing at Northwestern or beyond to try to address the pipeline of physician scientists, URMs particularly, going into research careers.
Yeah, your question is well articulated, so I don't think I need to repeat it. And you bring up two really relevant points. What was the inciting moment for any of us to become interested in science? Almost assuredly, someone helped kindle that curiosity. There was a mentor. Someone opened a door and showed you something remarkable that was happening in their data set or in their laboratory. That experience is absent from many of the people that you've identified. But the second thing you open up is not looking backwards, but looking forward. So we have a proliferation of T32 training grants at Northwestern. And in addition to my office as chief of cardiology, I have an office as vice dean of diversity and inclusion. And we actively engage with all of our T32 training grants to build a diversity and inclusion component to make certain that we are introducing the possibility of the opportunity. And I will tell you that a key attribute has been an aspect of the NIH, the diversity supplement grants, where those dollars are relatively easy to get. They help extend the work in a lab, and all one needs to do is to recruit a member of a targeted population. And you never know who gets turned on once they get introduced to science. So I applaud you for looking at the data in an aggregate way, but realize that part of it is being introduced, but the other is being intentional. And I think the NIH's policy is a great way to be intentional about it. Yes, good morning.
This is more of a comment than a question, but whenever you put the word privilege, and before you said that all of us here are privileged, I can probably check all the minority boxes, right? Born in Peru, Hispanic, female cardiology, interventional cardiology, hopefully. But even before you said that all of us were privileged, I felt like I was privileged just by being here and having the opportunity to listen to this and take it all in and learn from my peers and my attendings. So before you mentioned that, I was like, I feel very privileged. And so I think that's the best way to approach it and try to spread it out and take it from there.
Why do you think I do this?
Yeah.
I mean, I know what it's like to be underprivileged. I know what it's like to be poor. I know
Yeah.
what it's like to be hated.
So Claude, you can't steal her, so forget that.
But I do this because I have reaped an amazing bounty from cardiovascular medicine. And I acknowledge that I have the privilege of being a full professor, a vice dean, and everything that goes with that. But I'm restless. I don't want anyone else to have the journey that I had. So I want to open up these conversations. I want to engage people to think about the fact that it's not somebody else. It's with all of us to make a difference. And you can be a mentor, you can be a sponsor, you can be an ally. So it's all good. And if you don't get your interventional cardiology position, Eric.
Thank you so much. A tremendous talk. I have two quick questions. I don't want to go last. One, at Northwestern, do you share information in the C-suite around patients you serve by race and ethnicity. I speak to that because we were involved many years back in a program, Excellence in Cardiac Disease.
Yeah.
Second question, we are now engaging increasingly in a world that wants to take advantage and leverage computational strategies, including artificial intelligence, which many have concerned will increase the thinking fast construct.
Right.
So can you speak to those issues?
Yeah, so let me take the second one first because it is absolutely fascinating. There's a concern that at baseline, most algorithms that involve machine learning and ultimately inform artificial intelligence are biased because it identifies the data sets that are available. And if the data sets that are curated are not representative, then it becomes a problem. This is particularly troublesome in genetics because as much as we want to use large referent genetic databases to identify patterns that anticipate diseases, if those data sets are homogeneous in their construct, then it's very, very difficult to say that that helps us. It might actually bias away from the more open approach. So the notion that precision medicine would obviate the need to ever deal with race-based or ethnicity-based concerns is a little bit of an overstatement because we have to get the data set in those groups. That's the first thing. Your first question, though, is a very insightful one because we all know the demographics of the population we serve, but it's really hard to massage that. The people walk through the door, the people walk through the door. Now, what we are doing in the C-suite, and gets back to your question, we're starting pipeline programs, we're 10 years into it now, where we've started with high schools in Chicago, community colleges in Chicago, universities in Chicago, medical schools across the country, but we basically have pipeline programs from the 9th grade all the way through faculty that are targeting underrepresented in medicine, and it's working. And so that's where the focus is in our C-suite. Anything else? Any other questions? Yes, sir.
I was actually going to flip Eric's question a little bit on its head, that with clinical decision support, you have an opportunity to apply unbiased algorithms if the algorithm's unbiased to find people. So we've been doing some work on anticoagulation and identifying people that are unanticoagulated that have a CHA2 vascular rater for women to a rater for men. And we haven't looked at the data enough to know whether the groups that are unanticoagulated are underrepresented minorities, but I'm guessing they are. So, I mean, there's an opportunity there using the electronic medical record and clinical decision support, and I'm wondering if you have data from Northwestern or elsewhere to support that.
So, excellent point, and that is a scenario where we think it might actually make a difference. I'm also worried, though, about the more sinister aspect here. So let's say hospital readmission reduction program information. It's pretty easy from an electronic health record for a hospital to ping the patients that are coming back from seeking services repetitively. We actually did it in our own institution about 7 years ago. And we discovered that there were about 100 patients that were responsible for our penalty, 100 patients. Now, you can be responsible and reach out to them one by one and say, what can we do to help you? Or you can be draconian and try to exclude those people from services. So I think that if the steward, like you, of access to those algorithms is thinking about equitable care, then you are making it so that everybody gets a PCSK9 inhibitor, everybody gets an SGLT2 inhibitor, everybody gets a DOAC, everybody gets the RNA compound, et cetera. But there are other ways that information can be used. The point being is that we can never sanitize away bias. We have to always be aware of it because even with data sets, bias can be introduced. Yeah.
Nancy, that was incredible. We've come a long way with what you talked about, but it seems like just across the world there's a backlash against inclusion and diversity, people moving in the wrong direction. And certainly colleagues that we've known when they've spoken out against things like gun violence have had a big backlash, like
Right.
big Woodley. Do you think that physicians should play a bigger role in kind of getting outside of medicine and pushing against these trends?
That's That's an important question. And I have to say that I don't know that I have the answer. I can only give you my own bias. I am comfortable standing in front of any audience, no matter how large or how small, speaking about things about which I'm informed. But I think there are things beyond medicine that have so many more permutations, and context is so incredibly important that I'm careful lending my voice to issues about which I haven't studied, about issues that I'm not informed, about areas where there may be ramifications that I haven't anticipated. If you will, all of us at some point, you guys still are clinical trialists, and we always worry about the unintended consequence. And so that gives me pause there. I actually am still very much engaged with our federal government, despite the obvious. But I'm there because they need informed people to talk about minority health. But I'm not going to speak about anything else on that. That could be my fear, but I think that's a safe path.
Let's thank
Okay.
Dr.
Thank you.